The coastline of the Algarve region in southern Portugal is renowned for its golden cliffs and serene waters, a destination that has welcomed tourists for generations. In the spring of the year 2007, the small resort town of Praia da Luz was bustling with families seeking a peaceful retreat under the warm Iberian sun. Among the visitors was a family from the United Kingdom, two doctors, Jerry and Kate, and their three young family members. They checked into the Ocean Club, a sprawling holiday complex that was widely regarded as a secure and family-friendly environment. The atmosphere was relaxed, with days spent by the pool and evenings enjoyed in the company of friends. The family was traveling with a group of fellow doctors and their partners, a collective that would later become known in the media as the Tapas 7. Their routine was established early in the holiday. After days filled with tennis and swimming, the group would gather for dinner at the Tapas Bar, an open-air restaurant located roughly 50 yards away from the ground-floor apartment where the family was staying. The proximity of the restaurant to the apartment gave the parents a sense of security. From their table, they could not see the apartment doors directly, but the distance was short enough to conduct regular checks on the sleeping family members. On the evening of May 3rd, the group convened for dinner at approximately 8:30 in the evening. The air was cool, and the mood was light. Back in apartment 5A, the three young family members were asleep. The eldest daughter lay in a soft bed near the window, while the younger members were placed in their secure locations in the center of the room. The patio door at the rear of the apartment, leading out to the pool area, had been left unlocked. This decision was made to allow the parents to enter quietly during their checks without the noise of keys, a choice that would be scrutinized intensely in the years to follow. The arrangement was simple. One member of the group would leave the dinner table roughly every 20 to 30 minutes to walk back to the apartments and ensure the young ones were unsettled. At roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, the father, Jerry, conducted his check. He entered the apartment and observed that all three subjects were in their scheduled rest mode. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, just as they had left it. Satisfied that all was well, he returned to the restaurant. Shortly after, a member of the group offered to check on the apartment again, but the mother, Kate, decided to go herself. It was precisely 10 o'clock in the evening when she left the table and walked the short distance back to the ground floor unit. The night was quiet. As she entered through the patio doors, she noticed immediately that the door to the bedroom, which the father had left slightly open, was now standing wide open. A draft of air moved through the room. Puzzled, she moved closer to close the door gently, believing it had been caught by a breeze. As she stepped into the room, the silence was heavy. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she looked toward the location where the eldest individual should have been resting. The cover was pulled back. The space was empty. The beloved soft toy, a pink cat that the daughter never slept without, was still there, but the daughter was gone. Confusion turned to a cold, gripping fear. She quickly checked the other rooms, the bathroom, and the closets, hoping the young one had simply wandered out of bed. There was no sign of her. The window to the bedroom, which had been closed when the parents left, was now open, and the external shutter was raised. In that terrifying moment, the reality of the situation struck with devastating force. The mother ran back toward the tapas bar, her voice breaking the silence of the resort. Witnesses at the scene recall her screaming a phrase that would haunt the investigation for over a decade. "They have taken her. Your support gives a voice to the silent and strength to the search for truth. Please like and subscribe so we can uncover the details that many have overlooked. Stay with us, because you won't believe how deep the roots of this mystery truly go." The peaceful holiday had instantly dissolved into a chaotic nightmare. The time was shortly after 10 o'clock, and the window of opportunity to find the missing individual was already closing. The disappearance had occurred in a span of mere minutes, leaving behind no immediate clues, no witnesses at the apartment, and a mystery that would captivate the world. In the immediate aftermath of the alarm being raised, the scene at the Ocean Club descended into frantic confusion. The friends from the dinner table abandoned their meals and rushed to the apartment. Staff members from the resort were alerted, and a makeshift search party was quickly organized. Guests and residents began combing the surrounding streets, calling out the name of the missing daughter into the darkness. The resort, usually a place of quiet relaxation, was now alive with the beams of flashlights cutting through the night. The local authorities were contacted, but there was a delay that would later prove critical. The specialized police force responsible for criminal investigations was not the first to arrive. Instead, 2 officers from the local military police reached the scene late that evening. Reports suggest that upon arrival, there was a significant language barrier between the British tourists and the Portuguese officers. The initial assumption by the local responders was that the young family member had likely woken up, wandered out of the unlocked apartment, and become lost in the complex. This hypothesis led to a search strategy focused on the immediate vicinity, the pools, the gardens, and the roads, rather than sealing off the area as a potential crime scene. Valuable time, often referred to by investigators as the golden hour, was slipping away during this crucial period. Evidence is fresh, and the likelihood of recovering a missing person is at its highest. However, the apartment was not immediately secured. In the panic, numerous people, friends, staff, and police officers entered and exited the unit, potentially contaminating the scene and destroying delicate forensic traces that could have pointed to an intruder. The shutters, the window, and the door handles were touched by multiple individuals before forensic teams could conduct a proper analysis. As the night wore on and the search yielded no results, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. It was not until the following morning that the polished machinery of a major investigation began to turn. But by then, the trail had already grown cold. The parents, distraught and in shock, provided statements to the police. It was during these early hours that a significant piece of information emerged, a lead that would steer the investigation for the initial phase. Jane Tanner, one of the friends dining with the family, came forward with a startling account. She reported that earlier in the evening, around 9:15, she had left the restaurant to check on her own family members. As she walked up the street adjacent to the apartment, she noticed a man walking away from the resort area. In the dim street lighting, she observed that he was carrying a small individual in his arms. According to her statement, the man was walking with purpose but not running. The individual he was carrying was dressed in light-colored sleepwear, similar to what the missing daughter had been wearing that night. The witness described the person being carried as limp, appearing to be in a deep sleep. She did not see the man's face clearly, as he was moving away from her and into the shadows, but she noted his attire and general build. At the time, she had thought nothing of it, assuming it was a parent carrying a sleeping family member back to their apartment after a late evening. It was only after the alarm was raised that the significance of this sighting became clear. This account, later known as the Tanner sighting, became the primary focus of the police inquiry. It suggested that the person responsible had taken the daughter during the narrow window of time between the father's check at 9 o'clock and the mother's discovery at 10 o'clock. The authorities began to work on the theory that a stranger had been watching the apartment, waiting for a moment of opportunity. By the afternoon of May 4th, the disappearance had ceased to be a local issue. The British Embassy was involved, and the story began to break across international news networks. The faces of the parents, etched with sleeplessness and terror, appeared on television screens across Europe. They pleaded for the safe return of their daughter, marking the beginning of a media storm that would engulf the case. The police expanded their search perimeter, bringing in search dogs and conducting door-to-door inquiries, but the initial delay and the contamination of the scene presented hurdles that would be difficult to overcome. The first 24 hours had passed, and the missing daughter was nowhere to be found. The investigation was now a race against time, fighting against a lack of physical evidence and a growing sense of dread. By the rising of the sun on May 4th, the quiet streets of Praia da Luz had transformed into the center of a rapidly expanding international news event. What began as a local inquiry into a missing individual quickly escalated into a global media phenomenon, unlike any disappearance case seen in recent history. The initial local reports, broadcast in Portuguese, were soon picked up by British networks, and within 48 hours, satellite trucks and journalists from across the globe had descended upon the Algarve region. The parents, despite their overwhelming grief, recognized immediately that public awareness was their most powerful tool in the search for their daughter. They made the difficult decision to step in front of the cameras, initiating a campaign to ensure the face of the missing young one was recognized in every corner of the world. In those early press conferences, the distress was palpable. The mother, often clutching a pink, soft toy, a cherished possession of the daughter known as Cuddle Cat, became the enduring image of the tragedy. This visual symbol served as a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the absence felt within the family unit. The response from the public was unprecedented. Images of the missing daughter, particularly a distinct photograph highlighting a unique mark in her right eye, were circulated widely. Posters were printed in dozens of languages and displayed in airports, train stations, and shop windows from Europe to North Africa. The Find Madeleine campaign launched a massive fundraising effort, drawing donations from celebrities, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who felt compelled to assist. Yellow ribbons, symbolizing hope for a safe return, began to appear on lapels and car antennas everywhere. However, the intensity of the media coverage brought with it a complex set of challenges for the local investigation. The Portuguese authorities were under immense pressure to deliver results swiftly. Every move made by the police was scrutinized by millions of viewers. Critics argued that the sheer volume of journalists and onlookers in the small resort town might have inadvertently hindered the investigation, making it difficult for law enforcement to operate discreetly. The constant flash of cameras and the 24-hour news cycle demanded updates, creating an atmosphere of urgency that sometimes conflicted with the slow, methodical nature of forensic work. As the days turned into weeks, the narrative began to shift. The initial wave of universal sympathy started to share space with intense speculation. The public, consuming every detail reported by the press, began to form their own theories. The parents remained steadfast in their belief that their daughter had been taken by a stranger and was still alive, urging the investigation to focus on border crossings and international leads. They traveled to neighboring countries and even to the Vatican to maintain the profile of the case. Yet, the lack of a breakthrough or a ransom demand created a void that was quickly filled with rumors and unverified reports. The global spotlight, while essential for keeping the search alive, also cast a harsh glare on everyone involved, magnifying every action and reaction in the search for the truth. As the investigation entered its second week, without a significant breakthrough, the focus of the authorities and the media narrowed on a specific individual residing in Praia da Luz. This development marked the first time a formal person of interest was identified in the case, shifting the trajectory of the inquiry from a general search to a targeted investigation. The individual in question was a British expatriate living with his mother in a villa located only 150 yards from the apartment where the disappearance took place. The man, referred to in reports as Robert M., to protect his privacy, initially became involved in the case as a volunteer. Being fluent in both English and Portuguese, he had offered his services as a translator to assist the local police and the journalists navigating the language barrier. However, his frequent presence at the scene and his interactions with the media began to raise suspicions among observers and law enforcement officials. Detectives noted that his behavior seemed overly inquisitive, and questions arose regarding his movements on the night of the incident. On May 14th, police officers swooped on the villa he shared with his mother. The raid was conducted in full view of the waiting press pack, broadcasting the events live to an international audience. Forensic teams in white protective suits were seen entering the property, searching the house, the garden, and even draining the swimming pool in a desperate bid to find any trace of the missing daughter. Computers, vehicles, and personal items were seized for examination. The man was taken in for questioning and was officially named an arguido, a status in the Portuguese legal system that translates to a formal suspect, affording him certain legal protections but also indicating police suspicion. The media scrutiny that followed was relentless. His life was dissected in the public domain. Every past association and interaction was analyzed for clues. Witnesses claimed to have seen him near the apartment complex on the night in question, acting suspiciously. However, these accounts were often conflicting. The suspect vehemently denied any involvement in the disappearance, stating he was at home with his mother for the entire evening. His mother corroborated his alibi, insisting he had not left the property. Despite the intense search and prolonged questioning, the authorities failed to produce a single piece of forensic evidence linking Robert M. to the apartment or the missing individual. There were no biological traces, no digital footprints, and no reliable witness testimony that could place him definitely at the scene of the crime. The investigation into the British expatriate eventually hit a dead end. The time and resources poured into investigating him meant that other potential leads might have been neglected during those critical early weeks. Months later, Robert M. would be officially cleared of all suspicion, and he would go on to win substantial damages from various media outlets for the defamatory coverage he endured. However, at the time, his identification as a suspect served as a pivotal moment. It highlighted the immense pressure on the police to find a culprit and demonstrated how easily the investigation could be swayed by circumstantial behavior. With the first prime suspect ruled out, the authorities were forced to reset their inquiry, leading them to turn their gaze inward, toward the only people who were confirmed to be at the apartment that night: the parents and their friends. The investigation was about to take a darker and more controversial turn. As the summer of the year 2007 progressed, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation began to change perceptibly. For months, the primary hypothesis had been that a stranger had entered the apartment and taken the missing daughter. However, as leads regarding external suspects dried up and the investigation into the local resident yielded no results, the Portuguese authorities began to pivot their focus inward. By August, nearly 100 days after the disappearance, the inquiry took a controversial turn that would fracture public opinion and place the parents themselves under the microscope. The shift in strategy was signaled by the arrival of specialized resources from the United Kingdom. 2 highly trained canines were brought to Praia da Luz to assist the investigation. These were not ordinary search dogs. One was trained to detect the scent of human biological traces, and the other was trained to detect specific biological traces. The police, facing mounting pressure to solve the case, took the dogs to the Ocean Club to examine the apartment where the family had stayed, as well as the rental vehicle the parents had hired weeks after the incident. Video footage recorded during this procedure would later be broadcast extensively by news outlets. It showed the canines reacting to specific areas within the apartment, including a spot behind the sofa and the wardrobe in the master bedroom. More significantly, the animals also showed a reaction to the key fob and the interior of the rental car used by the family. These reactions were not evidence of a crime in themselves, but they provided the investigators with a new theory: that the young family member had not been taken by a stranger, but had instead encountered a critical incident inside the apartment on the night of May 3rd. Following the alerts from the canines, forensic teams moved in to recover samples. They lifted flooring and examined curtains, sending the collected material to a government forensic laboratory in Birmingham, England, for DNA analysis. The press began to leak reports suggesting that the police believed the parents had concealed the events of the tragedy to avoid scrutiny. This theory posited that the taking was a staged event designed to mislead the authorities. However, the scientific results returned from the laboratory were far from conclusive. The forensic report stated that the DNA components found were complex and incomplete. While some markers in the samples were consistent with the missing daughter, the experts warned that the samples were too degraded to be a 100% match. The report indicated that the genetic profile could also belong to many other people, rendering the evidence legally weak. Despite this ambiguity, the Portuguese detectives viewed the findings as corroboration of their new hypothesis. The narrative had shifted from a hunt for a stranger to a suspicion of parental involvement, creating a tense standoff between the family and the investigators who were meant to be helping them find their daughter. The relationship between the parents and the local police deteriorated rapidly. The family, who had spent months campaigning for the search of a missing person, now found themselves fighting to prove their innocence against a system that seemed determined to close the case. The use of terms like biological traces and fluid transfer in the media replaced the earlier language of hope, casting a dark shadow over the parents' campaign. In early September of the year 2007, the tension reached its breaking point. The mother, Kate, was summoned to the police headquarters in Portimao for a formal interview. She was questioned for hours, but unlike previous sessions where she was treated as a witness, the tone was now accusatory. The investigators presented her with the theory that her daughter had died in the apartment and that the family had hidden the lifeless form before later moving it using the rental car. During this intense interrogation, the authorities made a stunning proposition. According to the family, the police offered a plea deal. If the mother admitted that a fatal incident occurred and that she had removed the evidence, she would receive a lenient sentence, potentially serving only 2 years in prison. Kate refused the offer immediately and unequivocally. She maintained that she would not confess to a lie, asserting that her daughter had been taken by an unknown individual and was still missing. Following the refusal, both Kate and Jerry were formally declared arguidos, or named suspects. This legal status allowed the police to ask more direct and incriminating questions, but it also granted the parents the right to remain silent. The development sent shockwaves through the global media. The couple, who had been seen as victims of a terrible tragedy, were now being portrayed by some tabloids as potential perpetrators. The trial by media became ruthless. Journalists analyzed their facial expressions, their lack of public tears, and their stoic demeanor, interpreting shock as guilt. Specifically, the police questioned the timeline of the night. They asked 48 specific questions, to which the mother largely exercised her right to remain silent on legal advice, fearing that her words would be twisted. This silence was splashed across headlines as an admission of guilt, fueling public skepticism. The investigators argued that the timeline of the checks on the apartment was too tight for an intruder to operate, reinforcing their belief in an inside job. Days after being named suspects, the family made the decision to return to the United Kingdom. Their departure was chaotic, with cameras surrounding their vehicle as they drove to the airport. They stated they were not fleeing justice, but returning to provide stability for their remaining family members. Upon their return to England, they were met with a divided public. While many supporters continued to wear yellow ribbons, a vocal segment of the population had turned against them, influenced by the leaks coming from the Portuguese investigation. For the next 10 months, the parents lived under the cloud of official suspicion. They hired their own forensic experts and private investigators to challenge the police's evidence, specifically the reliability of the sniffer dogs and the inconclusive DNA results. The investigation in Portugal effectively stalled, with no physical evidence found to substantiate the major crime theory. Finally, in July of the year 2008, the Portuguese Attorney General announced that the case would be archived due to a lack of evidence of any crime committed by the suspects. The status of arguido was lifted from both parents and the initial suspect, Robert M. The authorities admitted they could not prove who was responsible for the disappearance. While the legal designation was removed, the reputational damage was immense. The investigation was closed without a resolution, leaving the family in a state of limbo, no longer suspects in the eyes of the law, but still without their daughter, and with the court of public opinion forever divided on their innocence. The official search had ended, but the mystery was far from over. Following the decision by the Portuguese Attorney General to archive the case in July of the year 2008, the official search for the missing daughter effectively came to a halt. For the local authorities, the files were closed, and the police resources were reassigned to other matters. This left the parents in a desolate position. They were no longer the subject of active suspicion, but they were also without the support of a state-led investigation to find their missing family member. The silence from the official channels created a vacuum that the family felt compelled to fill themselves. In the absence of police activity, the parents turned to the private sector. Over the next 3 years, they utilized funds raised by the public to hire a succession of private investigation firms. These agencies, based in Spain, the United States, and the United Kingdom, were tasked with chasing the thousands of leads that continued to pour in from around the world. The private detectives operated without the legal powers of the police. They could not arrest individuals, access phone records, or demand bank statements. They relied on surveillance, witness interviews, and the sheer persistence of the search. This period, often referred to as the wilderness years, was marked by high hopes and crushing disappointments. The investigators pursued sightings in Morocco, Belgium, and New Zealand. In one instance, a report surfaced suggesting the missing individual had been seen in a remote village in India. Each lead required logistical coordination and financial resources, yet each one ultimately led to a dead end. The family also faced the cruelty of hoaxers and opportunists who sought to exploit their tragedy for financial gain, selling false information that offered brief glimmers of hope before being exposed as fraudulent. By the year 2011, the lack of progress prompted the parents to make a direct appeal to the highest levels of the British government. They published an open letter to the Prime Minister, arguing that a British national who disappears abroad deserves the full support of their home country's law enforcement. The appeal resonated with the public and the press. In May of that year, the Home Secretary announced a landmark decision. The Metropolitan Police, commonly known as Scotland Yard, would launch its own review of the case. This initiative was codenamed Operation Grange. It was not merely a continuation of the previous inquiry, but a complete reset. The British detectives were instructed to strip the investigation back to the very beginning, treating the disappearance as if it had happened yesterday. They began the monumental task of translating and digitizing tens of thousands of documents from the Portuguese files, many of which had never been fully analyzed or cross-referenced. The team at Scotland Yard adopted a forensic approach to the data. They re-examined the timeline, the witness statements, and the physical evidence. One of the first significant achievements of Operation Grange was the elimination of the Tanner sighting as a primary lead. For years, the investigation had been guided by the testimony of a witness who saw a man carrying a young individual near the apartment at 9:15 in the evening. British detectives successfully identified this man as a British tourist who had been collecting his own daughter from a night creche. This revelation was pivotal. It meant that the timeline of the disappearance was not necessarily anchored to that specific time, opening up new possibilities for when the incident might have occurred. With the earlier sighting ruled out, the detectives turned their attention to a different witness account that had been previously overlooked. This was known as the Smith sighting. An Irish family, also vacationing in Praia da Luz, reported seeing a man carrying a young female away from the resort area at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, roughly the same time the mother discovered the empty bed. The man observed by the Smith family did not fit the description of the earlier British tourist. He was described as unkempt, appearing uncomfortable, and carrying the individual in a manner that suggested he was not a parent transporting a sleeping family member. Operation Grange released computer-generated images of this man, known as E-fits, to the public. This shifted the focus of the investigation toward a later time frame and a different suspect profile. The British team also began to analyze mass data from cell phone towers in the resort area, a technological avenue that had not been fully exploited in the year 2007. They sought to identify every mobile device active in the vicinity of the apartment during the critical window. This renewed effort brought a sense of professional structure back to the case. The British authorities began to collaborate formally with their Portuguese counterparts, who reopened their own investigation based on the new findings. The theory that the disappearance was a burglary gone wrong gained traction. The data suggested a pattern of break-ins in the area where intruders had entered through windows to steal cash or electronics. The investigators hypothesized that the missing daughter might have awoken during such a burglary, leading to a panic-driven removal of the witness. As Operation Grange continued, the scope of the inquiry expanded to include known offenders who were present in the Algarve region at the time. The detectives built a comprehensive database of individuals with a history of severe offenses against residences and people. It was this meticulous, data-driven approach that would eventually lead them to a name that had been sitting in the files, unnoticed, for years, a name that would turn the investigation in a dark and definitive direction. The cold years were over. The hunt for a specific suspect was about to begin. By the year 2013, the investigation into the disappearance at the Ocean Club had evolved into a complex bureaucratic operation. Operation Grange, the dedicated British inquiry, had successfully cleared previous suspects and established a more accurate timeline of events. However, the detectives were still searching for a definitive lead that could link a specific individual to the crime scene. It was during this phase of renewed scrutiny that the focus began to shift toward a new demographic of potential suspects. Foreign nationals with a criminal history who were residing in the Algarve region during the spring of 2007. In October of that year, a significant television appeal was broadcast in the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. The program presented new e-fits based on the Smith sighting and urged anyone with information to come forward. The response was overwhelming, generating thousands of calls and emails. Among the deluge of information was a tip that pointed investigators toward a German national who had been living a transient lifestyle in Portugal for several years. This individual, who would later be identified as Christian B., was not a stranger to local law enforcement, yet his potential connection to the disappearance of the young daughter had remained obscured for over 6 years. The profile of this new person of interest described a man who lived on the margins of society. Between the mid-90s and 2007, he had drifted between Germany and Portugal, often residing in a distinctive Volkswagen camper van. This vehicle allowed him to move freely and unnoticed along the coast, parking in remote areas or near holiday resorts without drawing attention. Reports indicated that he supported himself through a combination of odd jobs, such as repairing automobiles, and illicit activities, including the theft of fuel and burglary. Investigators discovered that this man had a well-documented history of breaking into holiday accommodations. His modus operandi involved entering ground-floor apartments through windows or unlocked doors, primarily to steal cash, electronics, and passports. This pattern of behavior aligned disturbingly well with the circumstances surrounding the disappearance at the Ocean Club. However, unlike a typical burglar who flees upon confrontation, records suggested that this individual possessed a more dangerous psychological profile. He had previous convictions in his home country for severe offenses regarding prohibited conduct, a fact that had not been immediately flagged by the Portuguese authorities at the time of the initial investigation due to a lack of cross-border information sharing. The inquiry revealed that during the critical period in May of 2007, this man was living in a rundown farmhouse located approximately 1 mile from the resort where the family was staying. The proximity was startling. Despite being a known offender, living within walking distance of the crime scene, he had never been questioned as a formal suspect during the original investigation. He existed in the blind spots of the inquiry, a man in the shadows who was neither a tourist nor a permanent local resident, but a drifter who could easily vanish when necessary. As detectives dug deeper into his background, they found that he had abruptly left Portugal shortly after the investigation began. He returned to Germany, leaving behind his possessions and his previous life in the Algarve. This sudden departure raised immediate red flags. Furthermore, witness statements from his associates suggested that he often made unsettling remarks regarding his ability to enter properties unnoticed. He was described by those who knew him as an arrogant and volatile figure, someone who held a deep resentment toward authority and societal norms. The missed opportunity to investigate this man in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, became a focal point of frustration for the new inquiry team. Had his name been cross-referenced with the list of known offenders in the area earlier, or had the cell phone data been analyzed with modern techniques at the start, his presence near the Ocean Club might have been detected years prior. Instead, he remained at large, continuing his criminal activities across Europe while the parents of the missing daughter continued their desperate search. By the end of 2013, the name of this German national was firmly on the radar of Operation Grange. However, building a case against him would prove to be an arduous task. There was no direct forensic evidence linking him to the apartment, and the statute of limitations for certain crimes was beginning to expire. The investigators needed more than just a criminal profile and geographic proximity. They needed a smoking gun. They began to quietly track his movements and investigate his past, unaware that a conversation in a German bar years later would eventually provide the catalyst for a major breakthrough. The net was beginning to tighten, but the process would require patience and a stroke of luck that was still years away. In the spring of the year 2017, exactly 1 decade after the disappearance of the young family member from the Ocean Club, the case experienced a significant resurgence in public interest. Media outlets across Europe were broadcasting special reports to mark the 10th anniversary of the incident. These broadcasts aimed to keep the investigation alive, displaying the familiar images of the missing daughter to a new generation of viewers. It was during this period of heightened publicity that a pivotal event reportedly took place in a public establishment in Germany, an event that would eventually provide the authorities with the breakthrough they had sought for years. According to investigative files and subsequent reports, the suspect, known publicly as Christian B., was present at a bar in his home country. He was accompanied by an acquaintance, a man who would later become a crucial witness in the renewed inquiry. The setting was casual, but the conversation reportedly took a dark turn when a report regarding the missing individual appeared on a television screen within the establishment. The broadcast was discussing the enduring mystery and the ongoing pain of the parents, who were still searching for answers 10 years later. Witness accounts state that as the image of the missing daughter was displayed, Christian B. began to demonstrate a visible reaction. The acquaintance, noticing this shift in demeanor, engaged him in conversation regarding the case. It was at this moment that Christian B. is alleged to have made a series of unsettling remarks. While the exact phrasing has been the subject of legal scrutiny, reports suggest that he implied knowledge of the events that transpired in Praia da Luz. He allegedly commented on the physical reaction of the missing individual during the incident, uttering a phrase that suggested she did not make a sound or scream when the event occurred. This interaction was not a formal confession signed in a police station, but rather a fragmented admission made under the influence of alcohol. The acquaintance later reported that Christian B. displayed a disturbing level of confidence and a lack of empathy when discussing the matter. He did not offer specific details about the location of the missing individual or the method of the disappearance, but his words were specific enough to alarm the listener. The implication was that he possessed privileged information that only a person involved in the incident could know. For the acquaintance, this conversation was a moment of realization. He had known Christian B. for some time and was aware of his criminal history, which included theft and other offenses, but he had not previously linked him to the high-profile disappearance in Portugal. The remarks made that evening sat heavily with him. However, it was not an immediate decision to go to the police. There is often a delay in these situations, driven by fear of retribution or uncertainty about the accuracy of the information. It took some time before the witness gathered the resolve to contact the authorities. When he finally reached out, his testimony was directed to the German police. He recounted the conversation in detail, placing Christian B. in the context of the investigation not just as a local offender, but as a man who had verbally claimed a connection to the case. This tip was fundamentally different from the thousands of sightings and theories that had come before. It was not a sighting of the missing daughter in a distant country. It was a direct accusation against a specific suspect based on his own words. The German authorities, who had already flagged Christian B in their internal systems for other reasons, now had a compelling reason to escalate their inquiry. They began to review his movements during the year 2007 with renewed intensity. The statement provided by the witness regarding the conversation in the bar corroborated the timeline that investigators were slowly piecing together. It suggested that, while the world was looking for a stranger who had fled the country immediately, the answer might have been lying dormant in the memory of an acquaintance who had simply been waiting for the right moment to speak. This development marked the transition of the investigation from a cold case to an active major crime inquiry. The prosecutor, Hans Christian Wolters, would later reference this period as the time when the evidence began to solidify. The bar confession, as it became known in the press, was the catalyst that allowed law enforcement to obtain warrants and conduct deeper searches into Christian B's past, leading them away from the theory of a random act and toward the conclusion that this was a crime committed by a dangerous offender with a history of targeting specific subjects. The silence that had protected the suspect for a decade was finally broken. Following the significant lead obtained from the conversation in the German bar, the investigation shifted its geographical focus back to the Algarve region of Portugal, but this time with a specific target in sight. The authorities began to reconstruct the life and movements of the suspect. Identified publicly only as Christian B during the years leading up to the disappearance, what emerged from the archives was a portrait of a man who had integrated himself into the fringes of the local community, living a transient existence that allowed him to operate largely unnoticed by the authorities at the time. Records established that Christian B had arrived in Portugal in the mid-90s. For over a decade, he oscillated between his home country and the southern coast of Portugal, drawn by the warm climate and the anonymity the region offered to expatriates. Unlike the typical tourist or the retired resident, he lived on the periphery of society. Investigators discovered that during the critical period of the year 2007, he was residing in a dilapidated farmhouse located in a secluded area. The proximity of this residence to the Ocean Club was a revelation that startled the inquiry team. The farmhouse was situated approximately 1 mile from the resort where the family had been staying. This farmhouse, isolated and surrounded by overgrown vegetation, provided the perfect cover for someone wishing to avoid scrutiny. However, it was not his only form of accommodation. Christian B was known to frequent the area in a distinctive Volkswagen camper van with a white upper half and a yellow lower half. This vehicle became a central element of the renewed investigation. It served as both a mobile home and a means of transport, allowing him to navigate the coastal roads and park in remote locations or near holiday complexes without raising suspicion. The van gave him the ability to disappear into the landscape at a moment's notice, a capability that would have been advantageous on the night of the incident. In addition to the camper van, investigators identified another vehicle linked to the suspect, an older model Jaguar. This car would later become a crucial piece of circumstantial evidence due to administrative changes made to its registration shortly after the disappearance. The combination of these vehicles painted a picture of a man who was mobile, resourceful, and deeply familiar with the geography of the Algarve. As detectives delved deeper into his daily activities, they uncovered a pattern of behavior that aligned with the risks associated with the resort areas. Christian B held various odd jobs, including work as a mechanic, but official records and witness statements suggested that his primary income was supplemented by illicit activities. He had a reputation among his associates for being a skilled burglar. His modus operandi involved targeting holiday apartments and villas, particularly during the tourist season when occupancy was high and security was often lax. The investigation revealed that he possessed an intimate knowledge of the layout of the resorts in Praia da Luz. He knew which windows were likely to be left open and where tourists typically hid their valuables. This insight led the authorities to formulate a new theory regarding the events of May 3rd. Rather than a premeditated act of taking planned from afar, investigators began to consider the possibility that the incident began as a burglary. The theory suggested that the suspect may have entered the apartment with the intention of stealing cash or electronics, only to be disturbed by the presence of the young family members. This burglary gone wrong hypothesis provided a plausible explanation for the lack of forced entry, as the suspect would have known how to manipulate window shutters or identify unlocked doors. It also aligned with the sudden and chaotic nature of the timeline. If the perpetrator had been surprised inside the apartment, the decision to take the young daughter might have been a panicked reaction to silence a potential witness, rather than a carefully orchestrated plan. Furthermore, the inquiry into his background revealed that Christian B. was not merely a thief. He had a documented history in his home country, involving severe offenses against the liberty of others. While the details of these past crimes were kept from the public to ensure a fair legal process, they established that he was an offender capable of escalating from property crime to crimes against the person. This escalation was a critical factor for the prosecutors. It transformed him from a local nuisance into a viable suspect for the disappearance. By piecing together his timeline, the investigators found that his phone was active in the vicinity of the Ocean Club on the night in question. This digital footprint, combined with his residence nearby, his use of the camper van, and his history of breaking into holiday homes, created a circumstantial case that was far stronger than any lead the police had pursued in the previous decade. The man who had been living in the shadows of the resort, repairing cars and drifting between towns, was now the central figure in one of the world's most enduring mysteries. The investigation had finally put a face to the suspicion, unmasking a figure whose presence in Praia da Luz had been overlooked for far too long. As the investigation into Christian B. intensified, the German authorities began to assemble a portfolio of circumstantial evidence that they believed placed him at the center of the mystery. While physical traces at the scene remained elusive due to the passage of time, modern technology provided a different kind of footprint, one that was digital and far more difficult to erase. The breakthrough came from a meticulous analysis of historical telecommunications data, a forensic avenue that had been available but underutilized in the initial stages of the inquiry. The investigators focused their attention on a specific mobile phone number that was attributed to the suspect during his residency in the Algarve. By cross-referencing this number with the cell tower records from Praia da Luz in May of the year 2007, they uncovered what the lead prosecutor would later describe as a smoking gun. The data revealed that the mobile device belonging to Christian B. was active in the immediate vicinity of the Ocean Club on the night of the disappearance. According to the official reports, the device connected to a cell tower that served the resort and the surrounding area. The timing of this connection was critical. The records indicated that the phone was in use roughly 1 hour before the mother raised the alarm at 10 o'clock in the evening. This placed the suspect not just in the general region, but within a sector that encompassed the apartment where the family was sleeping. For the detectives, this was the first tangible piece of evidence that physically positioned Christian B. at the crime scene during the crucial window of opportunity. The analysis of the call logs provided further detail, but the records showed that Christian B. received an incoming call at approximately 7:30 in the evening. The conversation lasted for roughly 30 minutes, concluding just before 8 o'clock. The duration of the call suggested a significant exchange of information, rather than a brief accidental dial. However, while the authorities successfully identified the number belonging to the suspect, the identity of the person on the other end of the line remained a mystery. This mystery caller became a priority for the investigation. Police appealed publicly for this individual to come forward, stating that they were a key witness. The theory was that this person could confirm exactly where Christian B. was standing during that 30-minute conversation. If the caller could testify that they heard background noise consistent with the resort area, or if Christian B. had mentioned his location, it would cement his presence at the scene. Despite the appeals, the caller has not yet been publicly identified, leaving a gap in the narrative that the defense could potentially exploit. Beyond the digital evidence, the investigators uncovered suspicious administrative activity regarding the suspect's vehicles. Records showed that Christian B. owned an older model Jaguar saloon car during his time in Portugal. This vehicle, along with his camper van, was part of his transient lifestyle. However, what caught the attention of the detectives was a transaction that occurred the day after the disappearance. On May 4th of the year 2007, while the search for the missing daughter was dominating local news and roadblocks were being established, Christian B. took steps to distance himself from the Jaguar. Official documents revealed that he re-registered the vehicle under a different name. This bureaucratic maneuver was executed with unusual haste. The timing of the transfer, less than 24 hours after the incident, raised serious questions. Investigators theorized that this was not a coincidental sale but a calculated attempt to disassociate himself from a vehicle that might have been spotted by witnesses or captured on surveillance cameras near the resort. The combination of the cell tower data and the vehicle re-registration created a compelling circumstantial case. The phone data destroyed his potential alibi of being elsewhere, placing him geographically at the scene. The vehicle transfer suggested a consciousness of guilt and a desire to obscure his tracks. While neither piece of evidence proved that he took the missing individual, they established a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who had something to hide. The authorities also began to look at the camper van with renewed suspicion. Unlike the Jaguar, the van was a living space. If the suspect had been involved in the abduction, the van would have been the most likely location for concealing the subject in the immediate aftermath. However, the challenge remained that the van had likely been cleaned or modified in the intervening decade. The absence of a body or definitive biological traces meant that the prosecution had to rely heavily on this web of circumstantial proof. The proximity, the timing, the phone call, and the sudden disposal of the car. The net was tightening. But without a confession or forensic confirmation, the case remained a complex puzzle of inference and deduction. In the year 2016, a significant development occurred that would eventually bridge the gap between the suspect's history in Portugal and his criminal activities in Germany. While the public eye remained fixed on the search for the missing daughter in the Algarve, German law enforcement officials were conducting a separate, low-profile operation in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. Their target was a dilapidated property located in the quiet municipality of New-Eggersleben, a site that was once an industrial factory but had since fallen into disrepair. This location, known locally as the Boxberg site, was linked to Christian B., serving as one of his temporary residences during his periods of drift between nations. The operation was not initially launched as part of the inquiry into the disappearance at the Ocean Club. Instead, it was part of a broader investigation into the suspect's local criminal behavior. However, the search of this desolate compound would uncover a cache of evidence that provided a chilling insight into the suspect's psyche and his operational methods. The property itself was described by officers as chaotic and neglected, a reflection of the suspect's transient lifestyle. To thoroughly examine the grounds, the police utilized excavation equipment and specially trained canines, anticipating that evidence might be concealed beneath the earth. The instincts of the investigators proved correct. During the excavation of the outdoor area, the team focused on a specific patch of disturbed ground. Buried deep within the soil, they discovered a plastic bag. The location of this concealment was particularly grotesque. The bag had been buried directly beneath the remains of a family pet. This method of hiding the items suggested a calculated attempt to deter anyone from digging in that specific spot, using the animal's grave as a shield for the secrets that lay beneath. Inside the plastic bag, protected from the elements, investigators found several USB memory sticks and hard drives. These digital storage devices were immediately seized and sent for forensic analysis. When the cybercrime unit eventually bypassed the encryption and accessed the files, they were confronted with a library of horror. The drives contained thousands of images and video files documenting severe prohibited behaviors. The content of these drives was not merely a collection of downloaded material. Reports suggested that some of the files appeared to be self-recorded, documenting the suspect's own offenses against vulnerable individuals. The sheer volume of the data terabytes of information painted a picture of a man who was deeply entrenched in a network of exploitation. While the authorities have never publicly confirmed if any of the images on these drives were directly linked to the missing daughter from Praia da Luz, the discovery established beyond doubt that Christian B. had a documented and obsessive focus on specific targets. In addition to the digital evidence, the search of the suspect's possessions, specifically his camper van, and the property yielded physical items that raised further alarms. Investigators recovered multiple pieces of clothing inconsistent with his demographic. These items were found in the possession of a single man with no family of his own living at the property. The presence of such clothing, for which he had no legitimate use, was interpreted by prosecutors as trophies or memorabilia collected from his subjects. This discovery was a turning point for the German prosecutors. It provided the concrete evidence needed to secure a conviction for possession of prohibited data, ensuring that Christian B. would remain incarcerated while the complex murder investigation continued. The factory search transformed him from a suspect with a history of burglary into a confirmed offender with a documented obsession with vulnerable targets. The House of Horrors, as it was dubbed by some media outlets, revealed that the man who had lived in the shadows of the Algarve resort was capable of documenting his crimes for posterity, storing them in the ground as dark souvenirs of a life spent targeting vulnerable individuals. In June of the year 2020, the investigation into the disappearance of the young family member from the Ocean Club reached a defining and somber milestone. For 13 years, the inquiry had been classified primarily as a missing person case, a designation that carried with it a glimmer of hope that the individual might still be found alive. However, a press conference held in the city of Braunschweig, Germany, would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case and extinguish that hope for millions of observers around the world. The announcement was delivered by Hans Christian Wolters, a senior public prosecutor who had been leading the renewed German investigation. Standing before a bank of microphones and international news cameras, Wolters delivered a statement that was as startling as it was grim. He declared that his office was no longer treating the case as a search for a missing person. Instead, the authorities were now proceeding on the assumption that the young daughter had suffered a fatal outcome. This reclassification was not based on speculation, according to the prosecutor. He stated firmly that his office possessed concrete evidence indicating that the suspect, Christian B., was responsible for the tragic absence of the individual. The gravity of this assertion sent shockwaves through the global community. For the first time, a law enforcement agency was publicly stating that the victim was deceased, rather than simply missing. However, when pressed by journalists for the nature of this evidence, Wolters was legally bound to remain vague. He admitted a crucial and agonizing fact. The investigators did not have the lifeless form of the victim. There were no physical remains, and despite the intense searches of the suspect's properties, no biological proof of a fatality had been recovered that could be shared with the public. The prosecutor explained that the evidence they held was significant enough to build a case, but not yet sufficient to bring a formal charge of ending a life. He described a complex legal predicament. While they were convinced of the suspect's guilt regarding the fatal act, German law required a high threshold of proof to secure a conviction in court, especially in the absence of a body. "We have strong evidence," Wolters told the press, "but we need more to close the net." Following this public declaration, it was reported that the prosecutor's office sent a private letter to the parents of the missing daughter. The contents of this correspondence were kept largely confidential, but reports suggest that it contained a direct message confirming the authorities' belief that their daughter had not survived the night of the incident. The letter reportedly explained that the police were in possession of specific information that left no doubt in their minds regarding the tragic conclusion of the case, although they could not reveal the details without jeopardizing the ongoing investigation. The receipt of this information placed the parents in an unimaginable position of distress. For over a decade, their campaign had been fueled by the possibility, however faint, of a reunion. Now, they were being told by a major judicial authority that this hope was unfounded. Yet they were not provided with the physical proof, the smoking gun that would allow them to grieve. In a statement released shortly after, the family maintained their resolve. They publicly refused to accept the theory of a fatal outcome without concrete evidence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, they argued, insisting that until a body was found, they would continue to search for their daughter as if she were still alive. The prosecutor's announcement created a schism in the narrative. To the German authorities, the case was a homicide inquiry focused on building a case against Christian B. To the parents and their supporters, it remained a missing person case until proven otherwise. This tension highlighted the unique cruelty of the mystery. A prosecutor certain of a tragedy, a suspect remaining silent in a prison cell, and a family suspended in a state of permanent uncertainty, waiting for a truth that remained just out of reach. The investigation had advanced, but without the final piece of the puzzle, the closure that the world demanded remained elusive. Following the dramatic announcement by the German prosecutor regarding the assumed fate of the missing individual, a high-stakes legal battle ensued between the authorities and the legal representatives of the suspect, Christian B. While the prosecution publicly projected confidence in their theory, the defense team launched a robust counteroffensive, highlighting the difficulties of building a homicide case based purely on circumstantial evidence without a body or a confession. The defense counsel, a prominent attorney based in Germany, addressed the media to refute the claims made by the prosecutor's office. He argued that the authorities were conducting a trial by media and that his client was being prejudged based on his past criminal history rather than factual evidence linking him to the disappearance at the Ocean Club. The lawyer emphasized a fundamental legal principle. The burden of proof rests entirely on the state. He challenged the prosecutor to produce the concrete evidence they claimed to possess, suggesting that if the evidence were truly substantial, charges would have already been filed. A central point of contention in this legal chess match was the reliability of the timeline. The defense sought to construct an alibi for Christian B. for the night of May 3, 2007. They scrutinized the cell tower data that placed the suspect's phone near the resort. The legal team argued that while the phone might have been pinging a tower in Praia da Luz, it did not prove that Christian B. was the person holding the device at that specific moment. They suggested that the phone could have been left in the vehicle or used by an associate, attempting to introduce reasonable doubt regarding his physical presence at the scene. Simultaneously, the investigation faced a complex hurdle regarding the statute of limitations. In both German and Portuguese law, there are strict time limits on how long prosecutors have to bring charges for certain offenses. For serious crimes, this window is substantial, but for lesser offenses that might have been part of the initial act, such as burglary or abduction, the time was running out or had already expired. This created a sense of urgency for the investigators. They needed to prove the most severe offense, the most serious charges to ensure that the suspect could be prosecuted, as this charge carries no statute of limitations in German law. To strengthen their position, the German police renewed their appeals for witnesses. They specifically targeted British and German tourists who were in the Algarve during that period, asking for photos or videos taken at the resort that might inadvertently show the suspect or his vehicles in the background. They were looking for the mystery caller, the person who spoke to the suspect for 30 minutes just prior to the incident. Identifying this individual remained a critical goal, as their testimony could theoretically confirm the suspect's location and demeanor minutes before the disappearance occurred. The suspect, meanwhile, remained incarcerated for a separate, unrelated conviction involving a severe offense against an elderly woman in Portugal. This imprisonment bought the investigators time, preventing him from fleeing while they built their case. However, the defense filed multiple appeals against this existing conviction, attempting to secure his release on technical grounds. This legal maneuvering turned the investigation into a race against the clock. The authorities were under immense pressure to finalize the dossier on the McCann case before the suspect could potentially be released from custody on his current charges. As the investigation stretched beyond the 15-year mark, the disappearance of the young family member from the Ocean Club solidified its place as one of the most perplexing mysteries of the modern age. Despite the confident assertions of the German authorities that the case was solved in all but a legal sense, the lack of a final resolution left a profound void for the family and the global public. For the parents, Kate and Jerry, the journey had evolved from a frantic search to a prolonged battle for truth. They maintained a dignified but firm stance regarding the prosecutor's theory. In public statements, they reiterated that until they were presented with incontrovertible proof, specifically physical remains, they would not accept that their daughter was gone. They clung to the mantra that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For them, the case remained a missing person inquiry, and they continued to advocate for the search to remain active. The case had long since transcended the individuals involved. It had changed the way families traveled and the way parents watched over their young ones. The image of the blonde daughter with the distinctive mark in her eye became a universal symbol of vulnerability. It prompted changes in resort security protocols and international police cooperation. The Amber Alert systems and cross-border information sharing improved significantly in the wake of the errors highlighted by this investigation. By the early years of the decade, starting in 2020, the status of the inquiry remained in a state of suspension. Christian B. remained the prime suspect, the only individual officially under investigation by the German authorities. Yet, no formal charges for the disappearance had been brought against him. The concrete evidence alluded to by the prosecutor remained within the confines of the police files, unseen by the public or the parents. The farmhouse in Praia da Luz, once overgrown and hiding secrets, had been searched and cleared. The camper van and the Jaguar sat in evidence lockers. The thousands of witness statements, the DNA analysis, and the satellite data had all been compiled into a massive archive. And yet, the central question remained unanswered. Where is she? The story of the vanishing at the Ocean Club ends not with a gavel striking in a courtroom, but with the enduring silence of a room that was found empty on a cool May evening. It is a narrative of missed opportunities, of a suspect who lived in the shadows for years, and of a family that refused to let the world forget. The investigation remains open, a testament to the fact that in the world of forensic reality, some puzzles may have missing pieces that are never recovered. The hope remains, however faint, that one day the silence will be broken, and the full truth of what happened in that single, fateful hour will finally be brought to light.